Hello and welcome to Going Dark, an intellectual dark web podcast. I'm Scott.
I'm Jack.
And I'm Peter.
So we talk about gender a lot in this podcast. We've talked about feminism, we've talked about gender, we've talked about supposed gender identity or gender identity disorders with transgenderism and whatnot. And this week I wanted to shift gears a little bit into talking about the equally or perhaps even more controversial topic of race, because that's what we do here on Going Dark. So I wanted to ask you both, Jack and Peter, what role do you think race plays in the culture war as we know it? What role do you think it plays in the woke supremacist narrative? Which that might be two different questions, but you can answer one or both of them.
I think the woke supremacy exploits race when it forces that diversity in a very non-natural and non-organic way. I think when it's not exploitative, it's more about just inclusion in a given organization, right? And so over time in our country, we become more inclusive, and this is a natural and I think really positive thing we all can agree on. But what's become irksome, I think, on the woke side is this sense that everyone's a racist, and everyone who doesn't adhere to an ambiguous set of ideas or language or whatever it is, you're going to receive that label. So,
in the words of Brett Weinstein, the bar for racism has been lowered to such a point that you could not help but trip over it, even if you're a completely not racist or even, in his case, historically anti-racist individual. So, yeah, I heard you use the term exploitative, and I think that really kind of hits the nail on the head in the way that I see the relationship between, I guess, white woke supremacists and ethnic minorities, at least as far as I know it, being American in the United States. I think that we see a relationship where you take the very loaded historical nature, particularly of the relationship between whites and blacks, and more recently whites and Latinos, but particularly whites and blacks. You see the nature of that relationship, which is loaded with so much historical pain and anguish and conflict. And you see it exploited for its emotional resonance in such a manner as to make things, no pun intended, very black and white, in that racists are bad and the anti-racists are good. You look at the famous picture of the white woman sneering and yelling at the black kids walking into that college in, I want to say it was Tennessee. And, the National Guard had to be deployed. Or actually, I think it was Alabama. And the National Guard had to be deployed to escort them in. And you immediately go, I want to be one of those National Guardsmen or one of those white students who is escorting the black students into the building, and you immediately think how evil and nasty that woman must be who's sneering and yelling at them. And I think that there's been an attempt to make that picture the story in places where it clearly should not and logically cannot be the case. The most obvious being the aforereferenced Brett Weinstein Evergreen College meltdown, where they tried to turn Brett Weinstein into the image of a sneering, aristocratic white lady saying, oh, how could you have these black people in my school? When in reality, he was a historically progressive and most importantly, anti-racist individual.
So it's interesting that you used the word anti-racist. And I think it was Douglas Murray made a point about this, where even the definition of the word anti-racist doesn't make sense, because no reasonable, sane person would ever describe themselves as a racist. And so it's kind of meaningless to say, well, I'm anti-racist, because no reasonable person would ever describe themselves as a racist. So it's kind of saying, oh, well, I am opposed to anybody who's a totally unreasonable person, which I think every reasonable person would agree with. So it's kind of this creating this false dichotomy. And I think this happens over and over again in kind of these woke spheres, because is racism real? Absolutely. Is all this implicit bias stuff real? Absolutely. We see this in all kinds of subconscious texts. The question is, how big of a problem is it, and what do we do about it? And how do we make sure that the response to these problems and these issues is proportionate to the degree to which they are problems? Because if it's just used as a cudgel to gain power for one group over another group, that's, I think, getting into what you're talking about with the exploitative nature of using race as a wedge in identity politics.
It makes it impossible to actually address any genuinely race-related issues which might exist. Like if you want to have a conversation about immigration, about police brutality, about poverty in areas where it's largely, minority people living there. If you want to have those conversations, it's literally impossible if one side of the conversation on the potential solution, often the side that is trying to take a more realistic approach and perhaps a more holistic and honest approach, is just being labeled racist.
Yeah, and that happens when we compare the Black Lives Matter to the All Lives Matter slogan. You're labeled a racist if you say all lives matter, because it's implied that, oh, so you're going to diminish the black lives again, which was the entire purpose of, our idea of the purpose of that movement was to raise awareness about black lives being abused and being marginalized, right? So that's a very clear example, to your point as well, Peter, that you're going to lose that battle because you can't even engage in that conversation about, well, I just say all lives matter because we're trying to equalize, right? That's the entire idea.
So I think this is, again, one of the reasons it's so difficult to even have a conversation around it, because when I see a lot of these woke narratives about race, like they are they have the appearance of virtue, but they're all virtue signaling. They're not real virtue. And I see a lot of the times that they're not even trying to address any actual problems. They're just trying to create anger or grab political power from another group. And they are kind of allied or have co-opted, I would say, very caring, reasonable people who actually do want to solve some of these problems in a very reasonable way that is also proportionate to the degree to which race is a problem in the US. And it's so hard to disentangle those two. And I think people will equivocate between these two groups and say, oh, well, if you are anti-woke, that means you're necessarily a racist. And it's like, no, there's actually kind of this middle ground of saying, and I think this is what you were saying with Brett Weinstein.
Yeah.
Where Brett Weinstein is kind of this middle ground person who doesn't buy into all the woke stuff and yet is still very clearly interested in a more equitable society. But he's trying to do so in a way that doesn't end up, just overturning the historical reigns of tyranny. And I think most people in the US want that. Like, I think they are craving that. And yet it seems like the wedge driven by identity politics, so often tied with race, is kind of creating these extreme groups that disallow for any sort of middle ground and make it difficult for us to even have a conversation around it.
So what do you think of this sort of concrete declaration that I want to propose on this topic, which is that we seem to be circling around this fact that you literally cannot actually problem solve with the woke supremacists whose sole goal, as it pertains to race, is to label their ideological opponents as racist and then use race as a cudgel to disempower them and eliminate them from the public discourse so that it becomes this ideologically, homogenous cult where no problem solving is actually being taken place. It's just one ideology, railroading the other. Could you say that I'm going to say that, and I want to know what you think about, is that unfortunately, and I wish it didn't have to be this way, but I would say personally, I'm not willing to, and I don't think anyone should be willing to attempt to solve these problems until this first problem is solved first. Like until we, and this is a common theme with the intellectual dark web and with the culture wars, until we agree on the rules of engagement for this type of discussion, it is literally impossible and it is pointless, and it opens up people pointlessly to, individual ruination to attempt to actually solve race-related issues as long as the conversation is here's a problem. Here's my proposed solution to it. Here's my proposed solution to it. Side A says to side B, you're racist. And now the conversation is about, no, I'm not racist. Yes, you are. And that's how it goes 10 out of 10 times. And for me, it's like, well, then we just can't have that conversation. Then literally, we're just going to have to focus on this conversation on why it's not racist to maybe approach certain issues of racial equity or equality with a slightly more skeptical or holistic approach or a more statistical approach. I mean, like basically, do you guys agree that it's sort of like, unfortunately, and I think we would all agree it's unfortunate, we can't address those issues until we address the sort of open discourse rules of engagement issue first?
So I'm going to present a potentially radical proposal here with regards to an alternative solution. I think what you're bringing up is that kind of within the context of politics and policy and existing institutions, it's impossible to solve this. Well, forget them. Like, why don't we solve it at an individual level and say, you know what, I'm not like, because we can't engage in policy and in discourse, let's have individuals take up the reins and wherever they can attempt to address these issues wherever it's possible. And I'm sure Jack, as the libertarian among us, values that opinion. But I think, you know, when we talk about Jordan Peterson, I mean, it's very much about individual sovereignty and picking up a load and kind of putting that back on the individual. And especially if we're living in a time where just the institutions don't work and they've been so kind of co-opted by these identity and power games, like, forget them. Like, let's not even bother trying to solve these problems through the institutions. I think the other question that we need to address is, well, how big are actually these problems in U.S. society? And I think that's another, I guess, source of disruption or misinformation, where I think the scope of the problem, nobody can even agree on the scope of the problem, or not nobody, but I think large groups of people have drastically different opinions about how big this problem is, or how big, say, implicit bias affects outcomes, or what are the other dimensions with regards to, say, socioeconomic success. What are the other dimensions that aren't related to just pure racism? So I think perhaps answering the first question, figuring out the scope of the problem, and then once sort of we've figured that out, well, what is the correct response from the individual perspective?
Yeah. So I really like that idea of there being an extra legal, an extra legislative, and really just an extra governmental set of solutions, an extra governmental faction that comes together to solve race-related issues. I kind of want to build that out a little bit. I mean, what do you think that would look like? Does that look like a collection of nonprofits that take a sort of a certain approach? Because there are lots of like mentorship organizations, but maybe if you had something that took a more, as we often say, Peterson-y approach in really educating people and empowering them to make change for themselves and to understand that they are not victims. This is the thing I really want to emphasize in maybe a conversation about building out this potential solution is I think that a lot of nonprofit organizations, a lot of governmental programs basically try to tell people, and a lot of media figures, just a lot of people who talk about these issues, try to, God, all the grifters like Michael Eric Dyson. I mean, he's a real piece of shit. But anyway, there are a lot of people in the space of supposedly trying to solve race issues that very much feed into a victim narrative and then try to get people to either fight back against the oppressor and that is their, you know, that is their narrative, or it's you need to rely on someone else to lift you up or to give you assistance. Something like, you know, affirmative action very much falls into this narrative of like, you need a leg up. Is there a way that we could have an extra governmental solution that is based on the capabilities of the individual? What would that look like?
Well, that's a good question. I think an example we can use that's current is what Candace Owens is doing. And she is pushing back against that victimhood narrative.
Yeah.
for a lot of young black entrepreneurs and conservatives. Obviously, that's clearly a biased political position, but regardless, we all agree that the victimhood narrative is a really bad thing, and she's pushing against that. And so she's an example of leading the youth by example. And so, if we can't look to the woke crowd to change, we at least have some other examples to say this is really what's a positive thing. And these kids are doing better in school, and they're reaching out through their communities, and they're actually fixing the problem. So I think part of it is lead by example, but also results, because a lot of these minority communities feel like there are no actual results happening regardless of who's elected.
Well, and you said something crucial specifically as it pertains to Candace Owens, and I actually really like where this is going, about denying the victim narrative very intentionally and in a really, really big, bombastic way. Like getting the attention of a lot of minorities and telling them, you are not victims. It is totally possible for you to succeed in this life, and it absolutely does not have to be at the expense of the supposed oppressor who, in fact, does not exist. And so what I'm starting to think is, what I think this movement would look like that we're kind of discussing, which is a movement that is extra-governmental, which is obviously a very anti-progressive idea, since progressives always want there to be a government solution. And this extra-governmental solution, what the shape that I think it would begin to take, and it's kind of hard to imagine, but it would be a mass movement of successful, free-thinking American blacks like Candace Owens, for all of her faults, like Candace Owens, like Kanye West to a certain extent, for all of his faults. Yeah. It would be a collection of people like that saying to particularly young black people who have an open future, don't think of yourself as a victim, and don't think of whites as an oppressor. Think of the world as and I would say there needs to be a movement like this for women as well. We need to just have people who belong to these groups in particular. Because like a guy can say to a woman, you're not oppressed, so many times, and she'll just be like, well, you're just saying that because you're a man. A white man can say to a black kid, you're not oppressed, and he'll just say, oh, well, you're just saying that because you're white. It means so much more when it comes from someone who actually belongs to that group. Like a Candace Owens, who is a woman and who is black.
Yeah, and highly successful.
And is very successful,
Yeah.
And is, as I understand, I believe self-made. I mean, she started putting out these ideas on YouTube. They may not be the most original ideas. I know Larry Elder has been saying these things for decades, but
Yeah.
I mean, there's only so many people who have the balls to say them, especially in the black community, because of what happens to blacks when they speak out like this. And it certainly happened to Larry Elder, and it certainly happened to Candace Owens. So I got to give her some credit. And I really do think that having a larger collective of figures like Larry Elder, like Candace Owens, like to a certain extent Kanye. Yeah. I think that having a big movement like that is a potential solution to some of the problems that we find. Because if you smash the victimhood narrative, fuck smashing the patriarchy. That's what you always hear about. Smash the victimhood narrative that insists upon the existence of a white supremacist patriarchy. If you smash that, I think you'll see a lot of upward mobility for a lot of people. Nothing hurts these communities more than them thinking of themselves as victims.
So I'm going to perhaps argue against our a little
Sure.
Plan that we're concocting here. All this is, of course, highly speculative. I mean, I think the research on this is very. I guess still a lot of it still needs to be done, and I think solutions need to be explored freely and openly. Perhaps to argue against this a little bit, and there's been a number of studies pointing to this, where from a socioeconomic perspective, America is becoming far more segregated over the last couple of decades, and it's not nearly as much about race as it is about just kind of where you are socioeconomically. And so kind of these communities that, say, used to exist, where you would have successful people interacting day to day with just a broader community that's, say, more representative of the country. Those communities don't exist nearly as much as they used to. And people have kind of self-segregated into sort of, either like highly educated or wealthy or kind of whatever else, whatever other dimension kind of exists. And so when you say, oh, well, this idea that, oh, well, people are just victims, and if they get rid of the victimhood narrative, then they'll be free. Well, if they don't actually have any opportunities to advance because of, say, socioeconomic segregation that is potentially in part just due to historical differences in success of, say, when your ancestors arrived in this country. I think there is potentially this roadblock that has been created that isn't purely a like this kind of self-sufficient narrative, American dream type, individualistic type of counter narrative that we're presenting. So I think there might be some evidence to support the fact that it's not just a mindset problem, that there are actually significant problems kind of that are much deeper in society, and they aren't necessarily due to racism, but they are correlated with race in some important ways.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up. And I think the distinction that you've drawn, which is an important distinction, is that I would say and simultaneously concede that I think the solution that I kind of proposed of just really focusing on the mindset and the psychology of being a Black American and the victimhood narrative, I think it would help middle-class Blacks a lot. I would maintain that. I think it would really, really help middle-class Black Americans, which, there is an existent Black middle class. It is smaller than the white middle class by an order of magnitude, but there is one. And I think that it would be really helpful for them if they were taught not to think of themselves as victims. But yes, and there is a obviously not insignificant portion of the Black community that is poor, that, in many cases lives in poverty, for which, of course, there are other actual, economic barriers that need to be removed. Because, I agree with you that you could go to somebody who is a poor Black kid whose parents were poor and maybe, don't have the best parenting skills in terms of, teaching their kids how to read at an advanced level, how to perform well in school. The school is not, well funded. You have these actual systemic barriers. And I guess you'd still have to have a conversation about what you do about those.
Well, I think this kind of gets back to why this issue is so difficult to discuss, because if there are really deep issues, let's say with just social mobility in general, and that's, intergenerational mobility on the socioeconomic status has declined over the last few decades. I mean, or kind of the more pessimistic take is, the boomers took all the good jobs and shut the doors behind them, so nobody can get in, right? So maybe that's a little generational warfare. And I do think, across many measures, we have seen the general, like any sort of institutional forms of bigotry have really plummeted over the last few decades. And that's a great thing. And yet from has this helped a lot of communities achieve equality of outcome? And it hasn't to nearly the extent that that maybe progressives at the time would have expected. And so now they've kind of latched onto this, implicit bias or whatever else. But I think there's potentially something else going on that's just correlated with just, race or bias from 60 or 70 years ago that exists in today's society that is potentially manifesting itself through the racial narrative, because that's just, if you talk about in-group, out-group dynamics, race is just such an easy one for sort of any demagogue to hold on to.
One of the major narratives that comes up often is the prison industrial complex. And people say that this is the new slavery, right? So I think this is one of the key issues that actually people from opposite political spectrums can actually come together and have conversations and dialogue about, ending the war on drugs, finding out why we have so many people in prison, Black and brown kids and Black and brown adults in general, and why is this happening? And I think there have been coalitions built around ending the drug war and ending these kind of really barbaric, laws about sending a kid to jail for years over just, a certain amount of marijuana. And I can't speak to how often this is happening statistically. I don't want to get into that, but I know it does happen, and there are many stories that have come out over time. not just police brutality, but just the drugs in general, and how that keeps them in the cycle of poverty. Because if you're going to create a kind of a new wave of young black or brown kids like rising out of poverty, that can't happen if they're still stuck in this environment. And of course, they're going to be less incentivized to break out of it if they're coming from broken homes, and that's maybe the crucial issue is how we can reform those homes. But if you have these legislative barriers and you have cops in these neighborhoods who, oftentimes we can't hold that against them if they're just enforcing the law, but the law itself may be broken in many cases. It's a really complex issue, but that's just one example of maybe something, not just a private solution, but a public solution that progressives and libertarians and other groups can come together and find laws that are less harsh on minority communities.
Well, and therein lies the difficulty in talking about and certainly in solving these race-related problems is that, as you both mentioned in the last things you said, Jack and Peter, it's actually not all these institutional biases that just directly lead to racism making the lives of black people difficult and then leading them on a path of, becoming a hapless criminal or what have you. That is the simplistic reductionist narrative of the woke supremacists is, oh, it's all institutional racism. We just need to make the institutions not racist anymore. Problem solved. That isn't the conversation. I mean, that clearly isn't the answer. Somebody like Larry Elder has pointed out these institutions actually are not systemically racist anymore. Now, you can still talk about the problems facing black and brown communities, black and Latino communities, and there are clearly major problems like poverty and crime. And yet the answer has to be more complicated. And this is what makes people not want to have the real conversation, because it's so much more complex and nobody really knows the answer unless they get to it through discourse, which we can't have as long as the discourse is about who's racist and who's not. It's going to be more complicated than just there's systemically racist institutions. We need to make them not racist anymore, and then everything will be better. And it's like, we can't solve those problems then, if that's how you're going to think of it. Because guess what? The institutions have actually become minimally biased in recent years. I mean, as you both said, it's been reduced to the point where that's clearly not the cause of this. This is something deeper, and we can't even have that conversation.
Yeah, and I don't want to say downplay the importance of the individual narrative shift. I mean, I think that's definitely a big part of the message that the ITW is bringing to the world in terms of, there is some individual component. I mean, if you look at Western liberalism, you can't just abdicate your own personal responsibility for your lot in life. And it's like, no matter what situation you're in, like there is something that you can do today to make your life better. And that might not be enough. That might be, only 5% of the actual problem. But I think for almost anybody out there, there is something that you can do. And I think people who have, say, worked hard and made difficult decisions in their lives, and then are still struggling or are still facing all kinds of problems, whether it's due to, drugs or families or just whatever else that is kind of holding them back in their lives, then I think I'm sort of much more willing to engage in sort of other solutions or kind of look at, say, larger scale social programs. So I think it definitely needs to be part of the message, because really, I mean, I just see I really don't see anything good coming out of this victimhood narrative. And it does just, every time I hear it from, whether it's a white person or a black person talking about the victimhood stuff, it's so cringeworthy in a sense. I mean, it's either some combination of trying to kind of take there's so much virtue signaling or attempting to be virtuous or abdicate responsibility for your actions. It's so messy in terms of like what the person actually means and values and wants to accomplish, that I think we could make a lot more progress with regards to this issue if we just drop that.
Yeah, there's a bucket of rhetoric from which you can just kind of like pick things out if you want to like talk about systemic racism and the institutional racism, and black people are being shot in the streets and they don't have any opportunity. It's like people just go on these little rants and these little tirades about how whites oppress blacks in the United States, and it is cringeworthy because it's all agenda, it's all rhetoric. There's no actual logic at play. There's no actual facts being discussed, or the facts are just wrong. Like they'll say something like, black people are being shot in the streets by Larry Elder, and others have pointed out that's actually not the case, that police aren't just rampantly shooting unarmed black men for no reason. It's just that whenever that does happen, and it does from time to time, because it's a big country with 300 million people and a lot of police officers, and when that does happen, the media covers it. It makes it seem like it's ubiquitous and like it's like something that happens all the time everywhere, when it's not. I want to get into some of the proposed solutions that exist for particularly the supposed, well, I wanted to get into the proposed solutions that exist for racism in the United States as it stands, particularly affirmative action and reparations, because there are some solutions like this that have been proposed, mostly by progressives. I mean, affirmative action is something that has historically been, I believe affirmative action has been historically supported by liberals, and then more recently, reparations has been supported by progressives. I want to start with affirmative action. I want to know if you guys think that affirmative action, race-based affirmative action to be specific, should be practiced. And if not race-based affirmative action, would you be open to affirmative action being practiced, particularly as it pertains to college admissions? Would you be open to it being practiced, maybe not with race, but instead on the basis of income or sort of economic geography?
Well, this is a controversial opinion, as one would expect it to be, but just because something good has come out of a given law or a practice doesn't mean that the law or practice is just in itself. So I'm not going to deny any positive benefits that have come to minority groups or individuals from affirmative action. But I can't support, especially a federal or state law that enforces affirmative action. So I can't support that. If it's a private one, again, I don't support it, but that's something you can work with on a local level or individual level. But yeah, I can't support it despite positive benefits coming from there.
So I think I remember this lawsuit with regards to particularly Asian American admissions in Harvard, and it kind of shows potentially some of the absurdity of making some of these policies so focused on race, specifically on race. And it's interesting to see these dynamics play out. I mean, kind of watch in a distance from fascination, and part of me just looks at this and it's like, are these institutions just so fundamentally broken, and that like, oh well, these are the gatekeepers, and Harvard is the key to the golden ticket in life, and so we're giving out the golden tickets. We need to make sure every racial group has the same number of golden tickets. It's just it's so absurd just thinking about it. That said, I think I would agree with Jack. There certainly has been historical benefits to affirmative action. It's one of those that I don't particularly see any harm in it outside of potentially some of these few situations where it just kind of reveals the absurdity of the potential premise behind it. I would say, like, if this is what the typical voter wants and this is what the typical voter supports, I'm all for it. Like, it's a democracy. Like, it was established through the democratic process. Is it my ideal solution to any of this? No. Has it helped? Yes. Am I okay with it?
Has it helped?
Yeah.
I don't know that it has. In some cases, haven't we seen a pretty steady poverty rate poverty for everyone in the United States has gone down over the course of the past 50 years, I believe. But in some cases, has affirmative action really worked?
Well, assuming that like these kids are going to these, better schools, they're not obviously producing better ideas since things haven't changed. So,
I'm just saying there's still a very high poverty rate for blacks and Latino people. Like, I don't know how much this has helped.
I guess the idea is that, they would be helped and supported, and they would build their own family out and then build new communities, give back.
Yeah, I mean, there are, say, network effects and other things where just being granted some of these opportunities, it's also, I don't necessarily know the right answer, and this seems like a reasonable enough answer that I would say, let's study the effects of this and either expand it or shrink it in proportion to whether it has actually been helpful or not. Where I think this policy is kind of, it's harmless enough, and nobody's going to get out there and say, no, we shouldn't be doing anything to help these people. Like, I think I think most people would agree that, yeah, there were some terrible things in this country's history, and there do need to be some proposed solutions to helping groups that just were put in a really bad place due to terrible policies that we used to have. And I think everybody would agree that we want potentially some solutions, and we can disagree on what those solutions are. And from my perspective, affirmative action seems harmless enough that let's try it, let's study it, let's try other things, let's study other things, and see what actually works.
But even if it works, I mean, isn't there something fundamentally racist about it? I mean, this is the argument that is really often had about affirmative action, is that in essence, you're trying to solve racism by engaging in pretty blatant racism. You're saying, okay, we've got a black kid with roughly the same SAT scores as this white kid, and he's got the same extracurriculars, he's got the same, like everything about these two students is roughly the same, or maybe even the white kid is doing slightly better in certain categories. Let's let the black kid in over the white kid.
So I think this both reveals some of the absurdity of this, because yes, that is exactly a case where you might have, say somebody who is coming from Nigerian oil money or something, who is
the fact that it's race based is what really makes it inexcusable. I would say.
So I think that kind of reveals that's kind of a corner case revealing the absurdity of it. I think there's also, I wouldn't necessarily call it racism. It's more, it does seem like a very genuine attempt to level the playing field, to correct for. It's not a perfect tool. Like, it is far from a perfect tool, but I think in the grand scheme of policies that can be implemented, it doesn't actually seem that bad from my perspective.
Yeah, racism is about the superiority of one race over another. This is not saying that they believe a minority is superior to a white person necessarily, but just that historically repressed, give them a leg up kind of attitude.
Well, it's discrimination by definition, and a lot of people would define racism as racial discrimination on the basis of race. It's not necessarily... I guess if, when you hit the button, or I mean, you don't hit the button, you stamp the application and you say black kid with lower scores accepted over white kid, you're not necessarily saying that he's superior to the white kid, but you're saying that you're going to give him something over the white kid, not on the basis of merit, but on the basis of race.
But I think this goes back to the multidimensionality of the problem that I was talking about before. Race, isn't a perfect tool for, say, correcting for, say, historical imbalances due to, say, policies 2 generations back, 3 generations back, but it's a sort of approximation, and from my perspective, it's a good enough approximation.
But should we be trying to retroactively bring justice to things from decades past through college admissions now?
Yeah, that's part of my problem too. If we're talking post-Civil War, reparations, yes. You were a forced slave. You should be given, everything that you didn't have, the basics of life, whatever.
Oh, you're saying that it just to clarify, you're saying that say the year is 1873,
yes,
and you literally were a slave, that you should receive reparations.
Yeah, I would vote for that. I would support that completely, obviously. And then, in the 1960s, there were black individuals who were capable and qualified to be at universities, but they were not allowed, right? So then you can make the argument for affirmative action.
Yeah, but now generations have passed.
I agree, yeah. And the solution now is, why are these communities broken? And, it's a multifaceted issue, perhaps welfare, broken homes, blah, blah, blah. But those are not related to white oppression, unless you would argue that welfare is I guess, once again, this is a politically biased opinion, but just welfare hasn't been good for those communities. So
It does kind of bring up this issue of like, how far back do you want to go? Like, Jews were slaves in Egypt. Did they ever get reparations from Egypt? No, because it was 3,000. I don't actually know. It was thousands of years ago.
Well, I mean, maybe I just want to potentially refocus on affirmative action because I think it's kind of two very radically different types of policies. So, Jack, I kind of that hypothetical is almost it's kind of meaningless because we're not in 1873. So it doesn't kind of address, say, the real potential problems that exist now. So from my perspective, I guess I'm not really coming at it from a, is this a, philosophically or politically pure type of position? It's more, well, how do we ensure that we have a stable cooperative society? And I think there are enough people in the U.S. who support these types of positions and who potentially genuinely feel bad and want to lift people up. And,
well, it's very controversial. It's like 50-50 on affirmative action.
But I think that's a lot of people. that is still a lot of people in the country who support this. And if, say, if only 50% of all, tax dollars ever went to supporting some affirmative action program, that's still a giant affirmative action program that we would have in, potentially not at the national level, but certainly at the state level. So I think I'm coming at it more from a perspective of how do we make sure that just everybody kind of cooperates and gets along and we live in a stable society, as opposed to this is the right way to organize a society, because we don't get to start from scratch. Like, we kind of have to work with the world and the system as it is in a lot of ways. And I think there are a lot of changes that we can make, and I think a lot of changes that we should make. But at the same time, it seems like the general public consciousness, the median voter, is in support of this. And so with regards to this specific affirmative action set of policies, or say related policies that are trying to accomplish a similar goal, I think we can't really just dismiss those just because there is such widespread support for them.
Yeah, and on principle, I obviously disagree with it, but I'm not going to rally against it. I'm not going to take up that cause.
I mean, I would argue that you're talking about sort of allowing affirmative action to maintain its existence in society on the basis that it is a net positive for society, even if it is perhaps philosophically wrong, but or even racist by definition. I would argue it has some negative impacts on society. It puts a lot of white students in college in the position of perhaps being resentful, and certainly Asian students, definitely Asian students. You have white and Asian students who are resentful of the fact that they had to work harder, that they literally had to do more to get the same result than black and brown students. And then you also have black and brown students who have to go to college the whole time not knowing whether or not they only got in on the basis of affirmative action and wondering constantly, did I actually work hard enough? Do I belong here? And the answer might be no. And that really sucks. Like, I feel like those are some negative impacts that you have that are very real and very tangible in people's minds. And that it would be simple enough and good for society if we just said, we're going to let people into college based on the objective criteria, and we're going to apply that criteria equally to everyone on the basis of race. Then there's no resentment and there's no second guessing. If you're a black or brown kid and you're at Harvard, it's because you met the criteria to be at Harvard, and it was the same for everyone as far as race is concerned.
But
and I
that's
think
not how college admissions works. Like, I mean, they don't seek just say, okay, this is one criteria, and based on this one criteria or these three criteria, this is what they look at. A much more holistic student, where it's like, oh, this person was an entrepreneur or a musician or has some very unique quality that we want to incorporate into the student body. And
should race be one of those qualities?
And should gender be one of those qualities? I mean, right?
No,
so I think no. Okay, interesting, because I mean, like, from my perspective, I'm like, would I want to go to college and it's just 90% dudes? Like, that just, I didn't think about
there's
that.
a lot of reasons why you might not want to do that, but at the end of the day, it's like, if that was
like, college is an experience. Like, it's so much less now about like skills and
is your
like,
experience enriched if you're forced to be around people who didn't actually meet the bar to get into the school and they're only there because some people feel bad about something that was done to their great grandfather?
I mean, I would argue they potentially. So the argument against what you just said is they didn't meet the bar because, say, their parents couldn't afford fancy SAT tutors or all these AP placement classes, or just their school just wasn't, their public school that they went to just wasn't as quote unquote good enough as somebody else. So that's kind of the counterpoint that I hear often. I want to concede that you are. And I feel like I've known these people who did go to a certain school that they were not qualified for and really, really struggled. And I think it does certainly fail a certain percentage of people. So I don't want to downplay that. And I think that's a very real downside. But I think we need to analyze this program. And like I said, I'm totally open to ending it. I want to see the analysis of it, because it's not immediately clear to me that the harms outweigh the benefits, and plus just if part of the program is just people want to feel good about themselves and say, hey, we're doing something, there's potentially value in that as well.
So I think that one of the points you made absolutely deserves an answer, because it's a valid point, and that's the point about like, oh well, so the black kid who he had like lower scores or whatever than the white kid, he didn't have the SAT prep tutors, and his parents couldn't afford books when he was a kid or whatever. So that's a totally valid point, that what you have there is, okay, so this black kid did more or did less, but he did more than you would expect considering what he had to work with. And when you compare that to the white kid, it almost is like he maybe has actually a higher drive and maybe even a higher intellect and more to contribute to the school. That's a valid point. My counter argument is, and the way I framed the question, I kind of left this possibility open, is why would it be race-based though? Because actually, the fact that the kid is black in no way guarantees that. It's kind of fucking racist when you think about it, to assume on the part of college admissions offices, they go, oh, this kid's black. That means he's poor. That means he struggled. That means he came from a community where it was harder for him to do well in school. So maybe the compromise that exists, as was in kind of the original framing of the question, is you have income-based.
So I think that is actually
race-based.
how this process is moving. So my understanding is maybe 20, 25 years ago, we just didn't have the data. We didn't have all the internet stuff. And so race was an approximation. Now we have all that detailed data, and we know what's the median income for the school that you went to, and what's the income distribution, and kind of even where are you in that income distribution. How much was your parents' house worth? All these things where you can actually infer what is the socioeconomic status that this person, what are the resources this person had to work with, and adjust for that. So there is some socioeconomic advantage, disadvantage score that is now incorporated into admissions. And I believe, and I think this kind of comes out of that Harvard lawsuit with
it's called an adversity score. I remember that.
The adversity score, and so I think they are moving in that direction to potentially sidestep some of these issues with essentially wealthy, successful Asians being quote unquote discriminated against in the admissions process, when really what they're trying to correct for is socioeconomic status rather than race. And I think race is, this gets back to the whole broader argument that I think we really struggle talking about race, because I think it's tied into so many of these other dimensions, whether it's socioeconomic or otherwise, that it's a simplifying way to talk about a whole host of things and then confuse them and then bludgeon your ideological opponent. So it's difficult to talk about, and I think there is positive movement with regards to how colleges are approaching this. That said, I'm not really a fan of the colleges anyway. So
I was going to jump on that as well.
Yeah.
That's another discussion, but just kind of the whole school system from the beginning to university and the structure of university and whether we can start doing trade schools. I mean, if that conversation can happen, we can maybe even find ways of getting people in disadvantaged situations into an area where they can really improve themselves and find success in life.
Yeah. So I'm much more open to, my position is generally, I am completely open to economic or geographical affirmative action. I'm completely against race-based affirmative action. And it seems like I know you don't necessarily have that same exact position, Jack and Peter, but it seems like we're revolving around that idea maybe. I just want to make the point, and this is kind of a slippery slope argument, and I'm realizing that as I'm saying it, but I want to put it out there, even though I understand it is a bit of a slippery slope argument. I want to put it out there anyway, because I do think it's of concern and that it's interesting, is this is kind of an intersectional equity style concept. Because what you have is you're going to say like, okay, this is an outcome. Whether or not you get into college is an outcome. It has a lot to do with the opportunities you have in life, but at the end of the day, it is also an outcome. And by definition, affirmative action is trying to guarantee equality of outcome. And Peterson and others have pointed out the problem with this, with the intersectional narrative, which is that there is an infinite number of fractionations by which you can try to parse out who is the most oppressed or who has had the most adversity, right? So say you were assigning adversity scores to everyone on the planet Earth. Everyone's score would be different. You would have the least adverse person, person 1, and then the person with the most adversity, the bisexual, transgender, disabled, Black, Latino, Native American woman, whatever the fuck, with one eye and two and one arm. But that you would have those infinite number of fractionations. And so I just kind of want to put out there, which I understand is a slippery slope argument, but it's like, I'm totally open to just, okay, what if it was purely based on socioeconomics? It had nothing to do with race. Totally open to that kind of makes sense, because then the argument can be made that you're talking about kids doing more with less or doing the same with less. Like if you have two kids that did equally well, you want to use it as like a tiebreaker. They did roughly the same on their SATs with their extracurriculars, with their GPA, but one of them came from a much more difficult situation, and that it's not based on race. I can see the argument of saying this kid did more with less. He has more drive, so he gets the spot. But I do think it's a slippery slope. I do think that then it's like, what's going to stop people from saying, why don't we take into account race and gender identity and all these other things which aren't necessarily relevant, as we pointed out. I don't know. I just don't know what the limiting principle is. Is the limiting principle, statistical analysis, as you kind of implied, Peter, which is it's undeniable that socioeconomic status has an impact has a huge impact on your ability to succeed in our system, in our society. It's not as clear that race has the same impact.
So maybe there's 2 points. One, I think college is also just becoming less important, and more people are seeing that. And so sort of these lottery tickets that these colleges are handing out, golden tickets, just aren't nearly as valuable as they used to be. And I think there's a lot of potential for people to succeed kind of outside of these traditional routes that have, I believe there was some study which actually said that going to college from a net lifetime wealth perspective, going to college is now actually a negative after accounting for the loans and the opportunity cost, and that the typical person, it's actually more valuable for you from a net wealth perspective to not go to college. It's a questionable, there's still peer review and all that, but it's definitely trending that way just with how expensive college has become. So one, I think hopefully we can just drop this issue entirely from the perspective specifically of colleges. And I think second, and this comes back to another brilliant Peterson lecture that he gave, is, how much do we want the winners to win and how much do we want the losers to lose? And I think potentially one of the arguments that I see, I would say people who are maybe really drawn to some of these intersectional woke narratives, they see in America the losers losing really badly, and they want to correct for that. And I think Peterson would agree that we can't, the floor in America is so low that we can't just let people sink all the way there and say, well, yeah, that's the way, things work out. And that does actually create an unstable society. And I think it's hard to say that race has nothing to do with it. And it might be difficult to quantify. It might say, oh, well, it involves reverse racism, and so it's, that's philosophically wrong. But I think there is some very fundamental problem where, whether it's like mass homelessness, and in particular, that's also very closely correlated with race. Mass incarceration also closely correlated with race, and you can kind of see these things, and it's hard to say that, well, we don't need to, we just need to be colorblind. And if we're colorblind, then the problems will all be solved through this natural process. I don't think we can go quite that far. I think, we certainly don't want to go down the totally woke route of this is the only thing that matters and let's make everything about this. But I think it is kind of related to that, maybe a dichotomy that Peterson brought up in terms of, we want a free, kind of more libertarian society where we can just let the people who are really good just run wild. But if at the same time, we create a giant underclass of people, and particularly if that underclass is all of one race or largely of one race, I don't think that's a problem we can just say, well, let's ignore it and it'll go away through its own means. I think just looking at sort of data, it seems wrong. I'm making a very abstract case, but I think it's more like it's more intuitive rather than say quantitative.
I agree that it needs to be addressed on some level. I just would maintain, and I think we seem to be in general agreement about this, that people's personal responsibility and capacity to control their own fate has to be a part of the narrative of how we solve this problem. Because at the end of the day, and this is something that gets brought up a lot by Ben Shapiro in particular and a few other people, you were talking about the people who lose the hardest in the United States and how hard that is to watch and how it's not good for society. So nobody wants to see a homeless person on the street begging for change. Nobody wants to see that. It's a terrible thing to see. But here's the fact of the matter. If you do three magical things, you have a 98% chance, or it's maybe even a 99% chance. It's a 98 or 99% chance of not living in poverty. And I think you have a 70% chance off the bat of being middle class or higher. And that is graduate from high school, get a job, and don't have children out of wedlock. People's personal choices and things that are under their control largely have a lot to do with their situation often when they have lost as hard as you can lose in the United States. And really in any Western capitalistic society. When you're at the very bottom of the hierarchy, there's usually some choice that you made at some point that led to that in some way. And we totally leave that out of the conversation. I'm not saying that's the only explanation, because then you can make the argument, it's like, well, look, it's hard not to become, addicted to drugs and a pregnant teenager if you grow up in a certain environment where that's par for the course and it was almost inevitable. And it's like, okay, well, it's not inevitable. We can say that it's hard, but I hate the narrative that totally leaves out even the possible notion that you could have made better choices if you're in that situation. So I want to talk about reparations for a tick. Basically, do we think that we should give Black Americans reparations for either, let's say, slavery, or maybe we would connect it instead to Jim Crow?
So I'm going to take another potentially pretty radical view here. So I definitely came down, I would say, probably more pro affirmative action than either of you with regards to just my feelings about the issue. I think reparations is it seems like a total farce and just a giant political move. I was just trying to think about, well, what would it take to actually implement reparations? So you would have, say, people who are descended from white slave owners, say, give $10,000 to people who are descended from black slaves. Well, how would you implement this? Okay, you study birth records. Well, what if people hid their records or tried to hide otherwise? Well, you do genetic tests. And then all of a sudden you have this giant database of people, classifying them as slave owners, descended from slave owners, or descended from slaves. And then you implement a tax from one group to the other. Like the proposition of implementing this just seems so absurd and so anti-liberal and so dystopian and authoritarian that I can't help but that this is just another political wedge in sort of the identity politics toolkit. And so, from a lot of perspectives, I even refuse to even entertain it. I think there are a lot of very liberal ways that we can address a lot of, say, inequities or whatever else. But it it seems so dystopian and takes us down a very bad route and reopens a lot of wounds and kind of it's also in this, kind of woke supremacist world, like there's no forgiveness, there's no apologies. Like it is you take your pound
Not
of
even
flesh.
200 years later.
Not even 200 years later, and it has to be this authoritarian, final equity. All the wealth gained from the labor of the slave holders needs to be, passed back to the slaves. And it's just so absurd, but also terrifying in that there are serious Democratic candidates who are entertaining this as a policy. Like it's terrifying to me.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with you. It's what you said about tearing open the wound. How unnecessary is that? Like, I'm sorry. Look, the American slavery, the American slave trade, it belongs in the history books, man. We got to teach our kids about it. I totally agree that it's a terrible stain on the history of our country, and it needs to be taught to our children so that they know what America was capable of in its founding, which is often romanticized to a certain degree, and that they understand some of the terrible things that have been done in this world, including in the United States, in relatively recent history. The notion that you're going to re-adjudicate it, like bring it back into the public consciousness in such a direct way where some people are supposed to pay other people, generations later, not only is no one who is alive today a slave, nobody who is alive today had a grandparent who was a slave. We are far too removed from this thing to be thinking about reparations for it, especially in the most direct sense. Now, you often hear the argument, it's like, oh, well, my version of reparations is just we invest more in black communities from the federal budget. And it's like, well, that's not really reparations. Don't call it that then. Like, come on. Like, it's like what people mean when they say reparations is black people are going to get a check.
Well, specifically, it has to be, just the divisions that we create, but it's like, well, okay, you have
it has to come from
you have
whites.
to prove that it is you have to prove that you were descended from a slave. And what if you were descended from both? Like, what if you
are mixed? Yeah,
and
that's actually very. If you were mixed,
right? Like, what then happens? You cut yourself a check, like, it's like, and then it's like, oh well, it's if say it was claiming the conception was non-consensual sex or something. It's just, it opens so many.
And the effects of that wealth transfer, it's like the idea of like, it's just this massive thing that you're doing to the economic system. And it's like if you eliminated a species from the ecosystem, it's just like the effects it would have are impossible to quantify of such a massive wealth transfer that is so weirdly established. It's between white slave owners, as you said, descendants of white slave owners and black slave. It's like, it is a logistical nightmare. Now, but I want to propose. So the other thing I said was, what if you said like, okay, slavery is a done deal. We're not going to re-adjudicate it with reparations. What if we focused on something that is significantly more recent by a matter of a full century, and that is the era of Jim Crow, de facto and de jure discrimination?
Don't call it reparations. That's my perspective. Where I think I would say, I think I defended a lot of affirmative action positions earlier. And so I think there are real problems and they need to be solved. They need to be solved in a very liberal way. I think when you use the word reparations and you tie it back to specifically the history of slavery from 150 years ago, I can't see it but anything except in this crazy identity politics lens that wants to make everything political and that wants to just rip out the kind of the worst instincts and feelings of humanity.
Let me steel man it a little bit. So I'm focusing on Jim Crow specifically, and I want to give let me steel man this. Let me give you like the most obvious example of someone who maybe would deserve reparations. So you got a guy, he's 75 years old. He lived through the era of Jim Crow racism, and it had a massive impact on his life. He couldn't vote. He was denied the franchise because of the Jim Crow racism in voting rights at the time, or the lack thereof of voting rights. He couldn't get jobs. He couldn't go to school. There are all these things he was kept from doing by racist whites and racist white institutions. He is alive today. He lived through this. Should he get a check, maybe just from the government? Maybe it doesn't come from somebody whose grandparent was a racist judge. Like it just comes directly from the federal budget. They just say everyone who can prove that they were severely impacted They were either denied admission to a college, denied a job. Like literally, they could present a rejection letter from a job that said, "Sorry, we don't hire Negroes." And if they do that, then, which by the way was a very real thing. People got those letters that literally said, "We do not hire blacks," or I mean, it would have been they would have said Negroes. They said, "We don't hire your kind," or "We won't allow your kind admission to our school." If you have records of that, could you maybe be entitled to something directly out of the federal budget, not coming from like another random, not random, another individual who is selected because they supposedly are a descendant of somebody who was a factor?
I don't know. I mean, I think that, if I'm going to take a liberal position and I favor these progressive policies, I still have to ask, like, what is this doing for those individuals? How is this fostering community or fostering small black businesses from thriving? So I would almost sidestep the issue and just say, let's just focus on the now and building the future. And I don't know how giving money, maybe reducing taxes for those communities, but I just can't see the net positive.
I mean, the form this would almost take, I mean, in essence, should a living black person who can prove that they faced severe discrimination directly from the government, should they be able to, in effect, sue the government? Say, pay me, this is how much money you costed me in my life purely on the basis of racist discrimination. Like, I am out hundreds of thousands of dollars because I was forced to be, a cashier in my small, hometown my whole life because I was denied admission to a college in, the 40s or 50s or whatever. I was denied a position as, an office worker because of my, like, should they be able to, in effect, sue certain individuals retroactively maybe? Should they be able to sue a business that denied them a job if it can be proven?
I almost agree with that if you could quantify it. But again, when you say they sue the government, where's that money coming from? It's not coming from if you could say it's coming from these previous, state officials who were there in 1960, sure, but the money's coming from us.
Yeah. So it's almost like there's a statute of limitations.
Yeah.
It's just, and the reason, for people that don't know, the reason statutes of limitations exist is because it is so hard to adjudicate something 30, 40, 50 years after the fact because of these kind of logistical issues. But, a lot of people hate the concept of a statute of limitations, and I can understand why. Something that was unjust is always unjust, especially if that person is still alive today in particular. That's where I start to sympathize. I really don't want to hear about like, oh, well, my great-great-grandfather was a slave. It's like, okay, that's 5 generations removed. But somebody, I kind of can at least begin to materialize the argument. You're talking about somebody who is literally went through it. They are still alive today. This is their experience. It is proven that there was a large impact on their life. I could see from their perspective why they want a fucking check from someone.
There's so many ways to go from here. One, I think, and again, I keep harping on this, and so I want to clarify. Don't call it reparations because it's. I think that,
it is a very loaded term.
That word is just so it's so divisive, and it's just so wrapped up in all the identity politics. So I think you are what you're proposing. It sounds like a much more liberal type of scenario. And it seems like, well, we're going to go through the courts and we're going to figure out what the impact was. Potentially there's some class action lawsuit, some kind of large scale civil laws. And I mean, it's strange because it gets into this area of law where the government didn't break the law at the time. The government broke today's law by being discriminatory. So it's kind of this strange situation where like ex post facto, but actually in civil courts, lawsuits can be ex post facto. So or some can and some can't. So it kind of has a whole loaded history with regards to potentially Supreme Court challenges. And then can you imagine this lawsuit going to the Supreme Court and what kind of divisions that would sow in society? Because that's where it would end up. Like something of this scale, if it was potentially hundreds of thousands or even 1 million people who were engaged in this lawsuit, it would get ugly really fast. And I think this is why I'm trying to say I really support affirmative action. Well, I'd say I support a lot of affirmative action, or at least the spirit that it is trying to accomplish. I think the idea of reparations seems very much against that spirit, and it seems to be divisive rather than uniting. I think another potential counterpoint is, okay, so what about women? Are women next? Are all women next?
Oh, would you give reparations to everyone?
For everything? Like the dimensionality of this is unreal. And it's like,
and this
maybe
is the problem
women
that
deserve
always
it.
arises. I mean, that's a really good point, because that is the ultimate fallacy of the intersectional narrative. You know, the equity intersectional narrative's inherent fallacy is that, man, there are so many different criteria by which you can count somebody as oppressed or discriminated against. As a matter of fact, there's an infinite number of times you can fractionate. It's the concept of like you can cut something in half an infinite number of times, you know, and you'll never get to zero. It's like, you know, one person is black, well, the other person's a black woman, well, the other person's a Jewish black woman, the other person's a disabled Jewish black woman, the other person's more profoundly disabled, the other person is poorer, the other person is blacker, the other you know, it's like, and it does get to a point where it sounds like a slippery slope argument, but the thing about a slippery slope argument is it's valid unless a limiting principle is determined. So yeah, I mean, maybe that's a discussion for another podcast. It's a big discussion. I think we want to go ahead and wrap up for today. But I want to thank our listeners. We're closing in on 500 subscribers. We're at about 450 right now, and I just want to thank you all. And soon we're going to have a subscriber update. I think when we hit 500 subscribers, we're going to do a little update, do a little thank you video. We'll do a little question and answer with you guys, maybe get to know you guys a little bit. You can get to know the three of us. I know we haven't really revealed very much about ourselves personally so far on the show, but we look forward to doing that. Right when we hit 500 subscribers, I think is when we're going to do that. And that should be soon. So I want to thank you all again for listening. We're on YouTube. Please subscribe to us there. Thanks for listening to us on iTunes and Spotify as well. Don't forget to like our video on YouTube if you're watching there. Subscribe to the channel and let us know what you think in the comments. Thanks again for listening.